Good afternoon, everybody, and I hope you're doing well as we move into the third week of conflict management. At this point in the quarter, we've made a lot of progress, and we're going to continue to move forward on some major assignments and other things. So this week, once again, we have a quiz as well as an activity to complete on Canvas. But for this week, there is a slightly higher reading load, so I am asking you to read both chapters 3 and 4 going into Friday. These two chapters get into major issues related to both the steps that we can take to deconstruct conflict, as well as some of the ways that conflict interacts with different cultures. So I'll be talking about both of those a little bit for today's video. Additionally, you might have noticed on the calendar that next week gets into the online study discussion. So the online study discussion is basically going to be your assignment next week. Instead of completing a textbook assignment along with a reading or quiz, I'm going to be asking you to participate in an online discussion on Canvas that'll be related to a major topic or issue. And what I'll be asking you to do through that participation is to engage with other students, to share your thoughts, ideas, insights, and so on. So when I go to post that assignment for next week, I'll have more details about some of the ways that I'm asking you to engage. But this is essentially an opportunity for you to apply and use the skills in conflict management that we've been talking about over the course of the quarter in an online setting. So this will hopefully be a useful and interesting way to apply some of the things that we've been doing in the class so far. Also, I've gone ahead and looked at your introductions, which are awesome. I also will have grades for you on your Chapter 2 assignment by the end of the week. So if you've turned that in late, remember it's minus 5% for each day an assignment is late. So I definitely recommend continuing to stay on track with your major assignments. Otherwise, let's get into some of the new stuff. So again, Chapter 3 is a focus on deconstructing conflict. You can think about deconstructing conflict as kind of like breaking apart something like a computer, right? If you're disassembling a computer, you have all of the different parts, like the monitor, the different keys, all the wiring, and so on. And in the same way, when it comes to conflict, we can deconstruct and break the conflict down into a lot of major elements. So we can use what's considered a structured guide to make sense of how a conflict has happened to allow us to better understand and deal with conflict in the future. Past is prologue. As you've seen through examples such as the Bay of Pigs invasion, oftentimes conflict management can go poorly. And so understanding and deconstructing a conflict allows us to better engage with it in future issues. This is also pretty distinct from the idea of decompressing a conflict or trying to de-escalate a conflict. De-escalation would be focusing on ending a conflict, while deconstructing is about understanding a conflict that already happened. There's 3 major pieces of evidence that we can use as part of the process of deconstructing conflict. That includes tangible evidence, self-reports, and witness reports. So tangible evidence could be something such as a book, a document, something that is really clear that was related to the conflict. So if you and a spouse are disagreeing over how bills should be paid, the bill would be an example of tangible evidence. Self-reports can include your own recollection of events or issues that occurred. But when you self-report something, like you say, oh, my friend and I got into this argument, there are going to be issues impacting its reliability, including your own perception skills or your ability to pick up on or understand what happened. So you are perceiving, you're receiving the information, and you're storing that information. Oh, I got into this big fight with somebody else. Memory skills are another factor too. To what degree do you remember this conflict and the different parties involved? And then lastly, messaging and coding skills will impact the reliability of self-reports too. So to what degree can you store that information for later use? A good example of this is if you've gotten into a car accident. You'll use self-reporting in order to share the car accident that happened. You'll perceive that you got into a car accident and remember that for later. You'll use memory skills to recall, they cut you off and T-boned you. And then messaging coding skills where you'll remember and view the vehicles as the crash happened. So this is an important element for us to think about in terms of self-reports being related to bias and our own point of view warping or changing how we remembered events. We might disagree. Somebody might say, you were raising your voice when we argued, even though you thought that you weren't. Lastly is the idea of witness reports, right, which have some similar problems in terms of recollecting information bias, but typically involve a third party or other individual who is reporting on the conflict that happened. So if you and your friend are arguing over who should be able to get a dog that you just adopted, a witness is a third party who's observing what happened and reporting. You two got pretty passionate about that. There's also 3 major ways to deconstruct conflict using different models. The first is Ware's conflict map. So Ware's conflict map includes a conflict history that explains the sort of thing that unfolded. So in World War II, here are the different countries that argued and the conflicts that emerged. The conflict context, what brought about some of the major issues. For instance, after World War I, some of the impacts economically on Germany. The conflict parties, or the groups that are in conflict with one another, such as the various countries. The conflict issues, which refers to the major topics that people are disagreeing about. The conflict dynamics, for instance, who is allied with who has more power than the other person. Alternative routes to solutions might look at the different ways that the conflict can be resolved. And then lastly, the idea of conflict regulation potential, or the degree to which a conflict can be managed going into the future. So Ware's conflict map is very concerned with understanding and making sense of the situation and understanding the conflict as an issue that can be explored. Meanwhile, the Hawker-Wilmot guide is a little bit different. It looks at the nature of the conflict, trying to understand, where this conflict is coming from. It understands our orientation to the conflict. So what are the different sides or countries that are at war with one another? What are the interests and goals of these different countries? What do they want? Do they want power? Do they want to maintain their territory? And so on. The power that different parties have, so how much authority do different countries wield over each other? The styles of conflict. So is there a lot of negotiation? Is there some pretty intense disputes between countries? Conflict and emotions are also linked. So to what degree do people feel passionately about an issue? Do they really want to just adopt this dog that you're arguing over? Analyzing interactions and patterns is important too. How has this conflict happened in the past? How will it happen in the future? What are attempted solutions? How did people try to broker something like a peace treaty in order to resolve the conflict? What are steps of negotiation? So how did parties work together to try to reach a solution to the conflict? And how did forgiveness and reconciliation factor into the equation as well? What were they able to do to resolve the issue? The Hawker-Wilmot guide is a little bit different because it's very focused on the emotions and feelings that are driving a conflict. If you want to understand why you and a spouse are disagreeing over significant issues like money, this is a good guide to make sense of the issue and what might be guiding the different approaches that you have. And then lastly, we have the idea of change-oriented conflict analysis. This is a multi-step process to help you understand a conflict. It involves the story, so what's the issue or topic being talked about? The information sources, so how do we know about this conflict? What is the context? Again, a kind of shared step where we understand what's causing this issue to happen. So what were the conditions in the world that set up World War II? The primary parties, so who are the major issues and people engaged in the conflict? Step 5 are the issues themselves. What are these parties arguing over? Step 6, what are the demands and interests of these different parties? So if you say, I really want to adopt this dog and the other person does too, that can be a step of competing demands. The step 7 is social reality of the different parties. So in other words, how do these different groups manage conflict? That relates to their moral reality, what they think is right or wrong, their justice reality, what they think should happen or should be done, and then lastly, how they approach conflict. So in other words, the parties are going to feel differently about the conflict. Maybe they think it's intractable and there's no way we can come up with a solution. Or maybe they feel like they need to work together to develop the most just approach to the issue. Step 8 looks at other potentially interested parties. For instance, if one person that wants the dog has a roommate, that's going to be affected by who gets the dog. What are the resources and power that parties have? Maybe one person who wants the dog had the dog for a longer time and has a closer relationship. And then lastly, what are settlement options or ways that the parties can work together? So through these 10 steps, change-oriented conflict analysis is really concerned with a constructive approach. It wants to understand how we can use conflict management in the future, whereas Hocker-Wilmot are much more concerned with emotions, and Ware is concerned with the role of context. So that gets at some of the major ideas in Chapter 3. Again, we deconstruct conflict and use these models to understand the different conflicts that happen every day. Chapter 4, meanwhile, gets at the role of culture. And this is actually surprisingly related to Chapter 3 because the way that different cultures might be comfortable with a third party or outsider group that witnesses or deals with the conflict might look different. In a more individualistic culture like the United States, we tend to value a more outsider mediator, somebody that doesn't have a stake in the conflict, because then we feel that they'll be able to make a more fair or objective interpretation of the conflict. Whereas in a lot of collectivistic cultures, there's a greater emphasis on wanting an insider who knows and understands the issues at stake in mediating or witnessing a conflict. So culture we can think about as sort of the rules that we play by. And the larger definition gets at the idea of the thoughts, experiences, and patterns of behavior and assumptions that we have as members of a group or society. So culture can be divided into many different areas. It might be divided into things such as race, ethnicity, the clubs or groups that you're a member of, and so on. So culture can exhibit a lot of different things. Maybe it relates to your family and your family traditions, the communities that you've spent a lot of your life in. Culture has been tied to things like the nationality that somebody has in a lot of situations. And culture is distinct from ethnicity, which is focused more on the descent and heritage that people might have. So the way that we engage in conflict is going to look a little bit different depending on cultures. In an individualistic culture, there's a focus on negotiation, focusing on solving the problem and working together toward a solution. Whereas in more of a collectivistic culture, there's a focus more on the harmony and work of the group. One idea brought out by Stella Tingtoomey is this idea of face work, or saving face. Saving face usually means that you're avoiding the idea of embarrassment. You're protecting your identity in societies, especially when there's potential conflict. So there is the idea that conflict can happen within members of the same culture, right? That would be intra-cultural conflict, where they have a similar experience and point of view. So for instance, if you're arguing with your family members over how to celebrate Thanksgiving, then that could be an intercultural conflict. When you're arguing with members of different cultures, that would be intercultural conflict. And that might be if you're arguing with a member of a much more different culture or identity than yourself about how we should celebrate Thanksgiving. They might have very different ideas, traditions, and beliefs about the holiday that could make it look really different. So these models help us to understand and make sense of some of the issues related to intercultural conflict and identity. Taken together, these two chapters help us to assess the conflicts that are happening in the world and break them down into their different parts, while also helping us to understand that culture and different aspects of identity can really impact the ways that we engage in conflicts too. Different cultures have different expectations and things that they're hoping to gain from potential conflict. So I hope that this is useful for you as you think about these two chapters and engage with this material. Again, complete the quiz and reading along with the activity for chapters 3 and 4. That'll cover it for this week. And next week, we'll focus on an online discussion activity you'll complete through Canvas in order to further engage on some of these issues with conflict management. I hope you all have an excellent week, and I'll be back next week for another video.